I'm Will Griffin. I'm a knife maker. The knife is the most important tool that a chef uses. A chef knife is the most versatile knife in the kitchen. If you have to buy one knife, make it a chef's knife. First, let's talk about steel. This knife here is Japanese, made in a Western style. You can see it has a lot of similarities to the Wursthof here, which is German made. The big difference between these two is that this knife is made of a carbon steel, a high carbon steel, not a stainless steel. This knife will react with the environment, so it will patina and darken over time and potentially rust as well. The patina on this steel right here is from 6 or 7 years of use in a professional kitchen, whereas the stainless steel knife, it won't patina or rust over time in most normal circumstances. The reason you might choose a carbon steel knife, carbon steel is easier to resharpen, and many people, myself included, prefer the aesthetics of a knife that adapts to its environment over time. The next thing to talk about is the hardness of the steel. You can control the hardness of the steel based on how you heat treat the steel as part of the knife making process. Here's a Japanese made knife with a very high level of hardness in the steel. The benefits of it are that it maintains its edge for longer, so you don't need to sharpen the edge as frequently. The downside of that is the edge is more brittle. I have an example of a very hard knife here that I dropped on my kitchen floor and the tip just broke right off. The Wursthof is a good example of a knife that's a little bit softer. There's pros and cons of that as well. So the softer knives, they won't retain an edge as long, but the edge won't chip as easily. And the whole knife in general will be more resistant to shock and abuse. If you were to drop it on your kitchen floor, the tip would kind of bend over and you could probably bend it back straight. So the next thing to talk about is the blade shape. So this type of a profile or blade shape, it's very flat along the edge. It's really well designed for slicing and for cutting things on a cutting board this way. The German style profile with the very rounded belly is much more designed to cut this way on the cutting board, so to rock along that curved belly. If we're now just talking about European style blade shapes, you've got the German guy here, and then here is this French chef knife. And you can see the difference in these profiles. So the French chef knife is a little bit more similar to the Japanese one in that it's pretty flat and tends to be a little bit more narrow. It's still rounded here, so it can still do that. But the fact that it's so straight on the back says to me that it's designed also for a lot of slicing and sort of push cutting techniques as well. Next, let's talk about blade thickness. Here's an example of a Japanese-made knife that's very thin. The thinner a knife is, the better it is for most cutting tasks. The only downside of a thin knife is that it can be more delicate when you start to talk about more robust foods. Anything where I might run into a bone or something, this knife isn't the knife for that job. One element of the thinness is that it doesn't have a lot of weight behind it. That can be a pro or a con. It's nice to have something that's light if you're chopping all day, but also sometimes you feel like a little bit more weight can help you get through things. And then the other example is the Wursthof here. Much thicker in cross-section. Thicker at the spine, but also thicker down at the edge as well. The thicker knife is just going to do better in situations where there's more stress put on the blade. One isn't necessarily better than the other, but I will say in general, if you can cook in a delicate way, then you should choose the thinnest knife that works for you, because the thinner the knife, the better it's going to move through the food. Let's talk about double bevel versus single bevel knives. This is a Japanese-made single bevel knife. The bevel refers to the part of the knife that's ground on a grinder down to the cutting edge. And you can see there's a line that's the transition between the bevel and the upper part of the knife. So this has a bevel on the right-hand side, but it does not have a bevel on the back side. Essentially, it's flat, although it's actually concave. There are a lot of benefits of knives like this. They cut extremely well. These knives are ideal for cutting raw fish. That's why sushi chefs use those sashimi knives. There's nothing like those in the world. But there are a number of downsides with these types of knives. The edges tend to be very, very delicate because of how thin they are, and it requires some learning and some experience to know how to sharpen these kind of knives, because it's a completely different sharpening technique than your double bevel. Another tricky part of these single bevel knives is that when you cut, the cut tends to want to wander away from the bevel. The knife just wants to pull over to the left a little bit. You can adapt to it and sort of adjust your technique and you can do it, but a double bevel knife will cut straight down. There's a small bevel here and a small one here, and it's ground equally on both sides. The benefits of that, there's a little bit more meat right at the edge of the knife, so it's a little bit more robust. They're also easier to sharpen. Another feature of these single bevel knives is that there's a handedness to them. So this is a right-handed knife. The handle is shaped to accommodate a right-handed grip, and the blade is actually a right-handed blade as well. So the bevel's on the right-hand side and the hollow is on the left-hand side. So it's designed for a right-handed person to cut this way. A left-handed knife would have the bevel on the left and the hollow over here, and the person would cut this way. If you're left-handed, be careful before you buy one of these. So let's talk about blade length. 240 millimeter, or let's say 9 inches up to around 10 inches, is a very common size for professional cooks. A larger knife can be good for processing a lot of ingredients quickly. You can line up more stuff on your cutting board and kind of get through it quicker. A larger knife has some downsides. They tend to be heavier because there's just more steel there. They can also just be overkill if you have a small space, if you use a small cutting board. I would say the most common size of chef knife out there is probably around an 8-inch chef knife. So this is the 8-inch Wusthof. Here's another 8-inch knife, the Japanese-made knife. That's a great all-around size for most things, and many people in restaurants use this size as well. But I also think there's something to be said for a knife that's smaller than 8 inches. So here's the Wusthof 6-inch chef knife. And I think this is a great size for people who have limited space. You feel like you have more control over a knife this size, especially like out towards the tip of the knife. I feel like I have more pinpoint control over that area than when I'm holding a knife like this and the tip is just so far away from where I'm holding it. So if you're doing mincing shallots, doing finer work, a small knife is great. And this is also big enough to chop carrots, do whatever. So if you don't do hours upon hours of prep work at home, the savings that come along with a smaller knife might be something to think about. Moving on to handles, first we're going to talk about the tang design. So here's a Japanese-made chef knife. Features a hidden tang style construction in the handle. It means that the steel of the blade extends part of the way into the handle and then is usually glued in there. And then there's a handle material that's shaped on top of that. Here's an example of a hidden tang knife with no handle on it. So it gives you a good sense of what's going on inside the handle of a hidden tang knife. And then if you compare the hidden tang to the full tang knife, here's the Wusthof again. The steel extends all the way through the handle, and then there's just 2 flat handle scales that are glued and riveted onto that steel. So there's a lot more mass and material back here in the handle, and that tends to move the weight of the knife back towards the handle. One difference to maybe think about is the hidden tang knife design is a little bit less suited to very heavy applications, I would say. It's not meant to be really hammered into the cutting board. A full tang design is much more robust in that area. You could be a little rougher on the knife and not worry about the handle coming apart with the tang. For most cooking applications, I wouldn't say there's a big difference in quality or strength between these 2 types of handle designs. Knife makers use a lot of different materials for their handles. Again, it's a matter of preference. This particular knife, this is a Victorinox. Their handles are made of this Fibrox material, a very food service kind of oriented knife. It's easy to wash. It's certified to not harbor bacteria and things like that, which is important in sort of institutional kitchens. So the material needs to suit the environment that it's being used in. There's also the Wusthof. They use just a black plastic material. It's a man-made material that's basically indestructible, very easy to maintain. It doesn't warp or change in dimension. A great material for ease of maintenance, I would say. Here's a handle that's very similar in design to the Wusthof, but this is the vintage French chef knife, and this is when they were still using wood on their handles. So that requires a little bit more maintenance than the man-made material. A wood handle might be appropriate for somebody who appreciates the beauty of the natural material and the uniqueness of it as well. No two pieces of wood are exactly alike, so there's some element of nature finding its way into the knife, which I appreciate. There are a really wide variety of handle shapes out there. The most important thing when it comes to choosing the shape of the handle of your knife is putting it in your hand and seeing how it feels. One thing that's characteristic of these is this flared out end of the handle here. That tends to hold your hand in place, and then it's got a little swell here that kind of fits your palm. If you look at the Sabatier, the French version, you can see how there's similarities but little differences. They both have the swell here at the end, but this one's just a little more narrow, a little straighter. You can even bring in a Western style chef knife but made in Japan. They've adopted a similar handle profile, just with a little bit more angular, I would say, but it has that same swell there, so that's a common feature. And then you can go to something like this. This is a chroma chef knife, and they've designed sort of an interesting thing here where the handle and this blade is one integral piece of steel. A knife like this I would certainly want to hold on to before I bought one, just to make sure that that feels comfortable to me. In cooking, there's two main ways you hold a chef knife. You hold it this way for doing heavy-duty chopping, and then you hold it this way with your fingers up pinching the blade, and that's for more fine work. So this leads us into a discussion about the balance of a chef knife. I would say balance is very much a matter of personal preference. And when we talk about balance, generally we mean where does the knife balance from this end to this end? If a knife is more blade heavy, it tends to balance out here. If a knife is more handle heavy, it tends to balance somewhere along the handle. This knife is very blade heavy. Some people prefer a more handle heavy knife, some people prefer a more blade heavy knife. A knife that balances in the front of your hand, where that first finger kind of is, tends to be a knife that feels balanced. If the balance point were to be way out here and I'm holding the knife here, that's going to be a knife that feels very top heavy. If the balance is way back here, it's going to feel like it takes a lot of extra work to get it to go this way. So in general, you want to look for a balance close to where you're holding it with this first finger. And both of these knives are close to that. This one happens to be a little bit in front of it. This one happens to be a little bit behind where that first finger is. But they're still generally balanced in that way. Another part of the handle to consider is the bolster. If you look at this Wusthof, you can see that this knife has a bolster. The bolster is this steel that's around the heel of the blade that sort of transitions into the handle here. If you take a look at one of the knives I made, there's no bolster here. So it's just the blade steel. That's the difference. Now, it's sort of a safety feature, the bolster. It prevents your finger from slipping up here and getting nicked on the very heel of the blade. That seems to be the main function of what the bolster is there to do, but that also comes with a very serious drawback. It becomes very, very difficult to sharpen this blade all the way down to the very corner. No bolster, you can get your fingers closer into where the blade is, whereas this knife, there's no sharp edge in the corner, so I can't use that for anything. Whereas this knife, I can use this sharp corner to do things. Those are the main differences. So as we've seen, there's a lot of variety in the materials and design and construction of chef knives. So when it comes to picking one, it's important to find a knife that you connect with, because you're going to be the one using it. And the more you like using it, the more you're going to be in the kitchen and the more fun you're going to have.